Just about every conversation on economics in the modern era begins with a discussion about capitalism as being one of the underlying assumptions. Capitalism, or maybe more appropriately termed classical economic theory, has had such an impact on economic thought that virtually every other approach or every other school of economic thought defines itself as a reaction to CET's successes or failures. Your textbook is going to go into a bit more depth on the various approaches or offshoots of classical economic theory. So what I want to do in this conversation is to fill in some of the gaps a bit by providing some background information into the logic and assumptions of CET, as well as some of the failures of CET. From here, it's going to be a little bit easier for you to evaluate some of the other approaches. So to start off with, we need to go back in time to the year 1776. Now, while we in the United States tend to think that the most important thing that happened in 1776 was the American Revolution, for the rest of the world, it might actually have been the writing of a book called The Wealth of Nations, which was written by Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scottish economist, and he was wrestling with the idea, what does a government or what does a state need to do if it wants to maximize its growth? It wants to maximize the size of its economy. The answer that he came to was something called efficiency. Basically, every state has a set of resources that are allocated to it. Maybe we're talking about arable farmland. Maybe what we're talking about are the labor pool or the labor resources. Maybe it's natural resources like oil or coal or timber. Whatever these resources are, they're finite and fixed. Even if they're a renewable resource like grain, you only get so much of it every year. Smith argued that what we had to do if we wanted to maximize the growth of the economy is to most efficiently as possible allocate the resources and the money that are available to us. Here's the problem. After thinking about this question for a while, Smith came to the conclusion that there's actually no one who sits in a position that is capable or is smart enough of knowing what the most efficient way to allocate resources will be in any given state. To know the answer to this question would require perfect knowledge. It would require a perfect understanding of the future. It would require understanding all of the economic factors that are going to be contributing to your state. Now, to understand why this is the case, think a little bit about your own personal pocketbook, the budget that you have for yourself every month or every year. If you had to think about what's the most efficient way of spending your own money, what you're probably going to do is consider the relationship between the price of the things that you have to buy and the value of the things that you have to buy. So I know that something might cost $10, but is it worth $10 to me? And if it is it worth more or is it less? What you are is a value maximizer. You want the most value for your money that your money can buy. Now this means getting the most goods at the lowest possible price without necessarily having to compromise on things like quality. So if you wanted to perfectly control your own personal economy, you would have to understand everything about the value of all goods and services for you. You might be able to do that. But could you do that for everyone in your city or in your state or in your entire country? Well, according to Smith, the answer is no, probably not. His solution is rather than letting the state to control things, to allow market forces to control things. And by market forces, he meant the natural invisible hand of the laws of supply and demand. His argument was that for every good that you might want to buy, let's use the example of pencils. If you want to buy pencils, there are people who are willing to manufacture them for you and sell them to you if they can make a profit. The bigger the profit, the greater the incentive for a new firm or a new company to jump into the pencil industry. If there's no profit, then existing companies or existing firms are probably going to stop wasting the resources and stop cutting down trees making wood pencils. We'll probably buy pens instead. There's the same thing existing for the demand market. People who are going to buy goods, such as yourself. These are the people who are trying to buy the most goods for the lowest possible price, trying to get the best value. So what Smith pointed out was that in the situations where demand equals supply, everything is fine. We're at an equilibrium. If demand exceeds supply, however, profits go up because prices go up, which means more people will enter into the industry. Conversely, when supply exceeds demand, I have too many producers making too much stuff, too many pencils. This will attract value shoppers, and I'll be able to buy more pencils at lower prices as the manufacturers try to deal with this excessive demand. So the result of this give and take between demand and supply, between value consumers versus profit maximizers, is the most efficient production possible, as well as the greatest level of growth and hopefully the lowest prices for the consumer. So what should the government do here? Well, according to Smith and his followers, the government should do absolutely nothing. Let the market work the way it's supposed to. And in fact, Smith's followers have identified 5 or 6 things that when government acts almost always lead to negative adverse effects on the economy. The first of these is tariffs. A tariff is a tax on goods that are being imported or exported to other countries. According to Smith, what I need to have is the lowest possible price for exchange to achieve the most effective or efficient allocation of resources. Now that might mean I realize that I can buy pencils more cheaply from another country, say Mexico, than what I can make them myself. Then I would use my resources, my wood, and my factories for making things that I can make a higher profit on. Same thing's true with immigration. According to classical theorists, we need to have as few immigration restrictions as possible. Labor is just another commodity, and the people who live in my state are just another resource. What that means is that if wage prices become too high, I need to be able to allow new laborers to move in. Otherwise, prices will get so high that manufacturers will simply go to another country. In other words, I can either import labor or I have to export jobs. Classical economic theorists are also opposed to things like taxes and regulations, because taxes take money away from consumers or from manufacturers, which means they can't buy or produce as much stuff. Regulations have the effect of raising prices because the manufacturer has to meet regulations. About the only thing worse than these 4 things, according to CET, are deficits and debt. Now the reason is that in order for you to have a deficit, the government's going to have to borrow money from the manufacturing sector. People who would otherwise build more pencil plants are going to be giving the money to the government. When the government borrows, fewer pencils. The other problem with deficits is that if I borrow money this year, at some point in the future I have to pay it back, and I have to pay it back with interest, which means that higher deficits today are going to lead to more borrowing or higher taxation tomorrow. Now, all of this made perfect sense. It made perfect sense to the United States because we were capitalist or classical economic theorists for the most part for most of our history. The problem is that over time we became aware of the fact that there are some problems with classical economic theory. See, classical economic theory hinges on some basic assumptions, some things that must be true in order for it to operate effectively. The first of these assumptions is that CET requires something called perfect competition. And what does that mean? Perfect competition simply means that 2 things have to be true. 1, no firm or consumer can be so important to the economy that if it changes its behavior, the entire economy is going to be transformed. So no banks that are too big to fail, or no manufacturing plants that are so big the entire economy will collapse if they have to close, or that prices of automobiles will rapidly fluctuate if one manufacturer goes out of business. The second thing that must be true is that there can be no restrictions on the addition of new producers or new consumers to the economy. That way, if prices get too high, we can simply have a new manufacturer jump in. If there are rules stopping that from happening, no perfect competition. The second thing that CET assumes to be true is that there is going to be no intervention from government. They prescribe it, therefore it won't happen. If that's the case, this means that government must have the ability to stay out of the economy. There won't be pressures on it to intervene. And to be perfectly honest, this is almost impossible. Think about a democracy where the elected officials only keep their jobs if the economy is growing. Convincing them not to intervene, to improve the economy in the short term so they can keep their jobs longer is kind of difficult to do. The same thing's true if we're talking about regimes that are dictatorial, where they know that if the economy underperforms, the result is going to be protests in the streets and the potential for a military-based coup like the one that we saw recently in Egypt.